Good morning. I invite you to take your Bibles and open to the Gospel of John to chapter 18. We're continuing our study this morning of Jesus in the Gospel of John. But I also want to invite you to join us for a Good Friday presentation that will be ready on Good Friday. It's an adaptation of a service that we did in our church several years ago called a Silent Good Friday. And I hope if you take the time to experience this presentation, it will be meaningful to you in your preparation during this Holy Week. On his last day before his death, in a setting of privacy and intimacy and fellowship, Jesus gathered in a room to share a final meal with his disciples, where he spent the time preparing them for his impending death. But things are about to change. Once they leave, the situation is going to escalate dramatically. So John begins the 18th chapter this way. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with the disciples over the ravine of Kidron, where there was a garden in which he entered with his disciples. Now this is the Garden of Gethsemane. And unlike the other Gospels, John doesn't mention anything about the emotional state of Jesus, his prayer to the Father, or even the sleeping disciples. John's focus is on the events that are going to ultimately lead to the crucifixion of Jesus on a Roman cross, which are reported in chapters 18 and 19. And while several others will play a part of this drama, the spotlight is clearly on Jesus. John wants us to keep our eyes on Jesus, and he wants us to see, first of all, that he was betrayed by his disciples. In verse 2, we read, "Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So Jesus, knowing that all things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, 'Whom do you seek?' And they answered, 'Jesus the Nazarene.' And he said to them, 'I am he.' And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them." Now, John doesn't mention that Jesus was betrayed by a kiss. In Matthew's account, the Bible says, "Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, 'Whoever I kiss, he's the one, seize him.' And immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, 'Hail, Rabbi,' and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, 'Friend, do what you've come for.'" For whatever reason, John has no interest in letting us know anything about Judas other than the fact that he was a traitor. Earlier, when Mary had anointed the feet of Jesus with some very expensive perfume and wiped his feet with her hair, Judas, who was the treasurer of the group, objected to the wastefulness of her act and questioned why the perfume had not been sold and the money given to the poor. John was quick to comment. Now, he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. I've been intrigued why Judas would help himself to the money box. I don't know how much money would have been in that box at any given point, but I can't imagine that it would have been a huge amount. Following Jesus wasn't going to make someone rich. And even though Jesus taught a lot about money and what true riches really were, he said of himself, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." The fact that Judas would steal from the minimal resources of the disciples is a commentary on his real character. It's been said that a profane person is one who has a price. In other words, there's a point where he will sell out. There's an old anecdote and versions that have been attributed to several people, but it goes something like this, where a man walks up to a woman in a bar and says, "Will you spend the night with me for $1 million?" And she thinks for a second and says, "Sure." And the man says, "Will you spend the night with me for $1?" And the woman throws her drink into the man's face and says, "What kind of woman do you think I am?" And he says, we already know the answer to that. Now we're just negotiating price. For Judas, who Jesus called the son of perdition, or the one headed for destruction, his price was 30 pieces of silver. Judas had lived with the Lord Jesus for close to 3 years. He had listened to him teach. He had watched him perform miracles, and yet he knew very little about him. While I can't confirm what motivated Judas to finally sell out and betray Jesus, John makes it clear that what Judas did was consistent with his character. One commentary said Judas was not an unusual monster, but a common man caught in a common sin, greed, which Satan used to accomplish his purpose. I don't know if John would agree or not, but after the betrayal in the garden, John does not mention Judas again. The betrayal of Judas was the ultimate betrayal. But there is another betrayal in the 18th chapter of John, the betrayal of Peter and the rest of the disciples. You see, unlike Judas, Peter had confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Peter was a true disciple, even a member of that inner circle with James and John. Peter had boldly confessed that he would follow Jesus to the grave. Before Judas had arrived, perhaps somewhere on the way to the garden, Matthew records that Jesus said, "You will all fall away of me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." But Peter said to him, "Even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same thing too. All of the disciples affirmed their loyalty and allegiance, but it's Peter who's signaled out by Jesus. And yet for a moment, the words of our Lord seem to have fallen on deaf ears, because John writes in verse 10, Simon Peter, then having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus. Why a fisherman had a sword in the first place is intriguing. And either Peter was extremely accurate or, more probable, horribly inaccurate. Because instead of severing the head of Malchus, he only succeeds in cutting off his ear. Luke adds, by the way, that Jesus healed Malchus's ear. But it is again an indication of Peter's rash behavior. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put the sword into its sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" Just a few hours later, Peter would fulfill Jesus' words and deny that he even knew Jesus. Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of the man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Down in verse 27, so they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And Peter denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Jesus was betrayed by his disciples, and he was blamed by his religious leaders. Led by Judas, who came to arrest Jesus, included a Roman military unit and officers from the chief priests. Judas, then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. A Roman cohort was 540 men, and the officers here were temple guards, all who came heavily armed. And whether the entire cohort was present or not, they appear to have been at the disposal of Judas. John continues in verse 12, so the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. I want us to understand that from the moment Jesus is arrested, there are these two contrasting realities and forces at work. The voluntary, deliberate choice of obedience to his Father's will by the Son of God, and the sinful, illegal actions of his enemies. By the time that Jesus is brought to Pilate early the next morning, several violations of Jewish legal law had already occurred. There's nothing fair about what takes place in these late night hours. There's no genuine desire for justice. And though Jesus stands trial, in fact, several times, there is no fair, no unbiased, no legal trial. Jesus is the victim of a witch hunt where the Jewish religious leaders had already sentenced him to death. The trial before Annas was more like an informal hearing. It was a fishing expedition, and it was both illegal and brutal. Annas had been the high priest, but had been disposed by the Romans. Caiaphas, his son-in-law, was the ruling high priest, but it could be argued that Annas was the one still behind the scenes calling the shots. In verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews came together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why are you questioning me? Question those who've heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. And when he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way that you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? See, Annas had some questions, but he wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for ammunition to use against Jesus. And so Jesus responded with a question of his own. Where are the witnesses? You see, Jewish law demanded that an accusation be brought by a minimum of 2 witnesses who had to agree to, in every particular to the last detail, and those witnesses had to be called before a prisoner was questioned. But Annas defied the law. Jesus knew his rights, and his challenge was a direct rebuke to the proceedings, which resulted in one of the assistants of the high priest giving Jesus an insulting, open-handed slap on the face and demanded some respect for the high priest. Jesus, however, did not back down, but instead challenged this minor official to be a witness himself as to how Jesus was wrong. But if Jesus was correct in terms of his rights in such a hearing, then the man needed to answer the question why he struck Jesus. Not getting anywhere, the farce of justice shifts to the house of Caiaphas. John gives us little detail, so it might be helpful to hear Matthew's account. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they could put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on 2 came forward. And they said, this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Did you catch the fact that the chief priests and the Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony against Jesus and still couldn't find any? It's mind-numbing. Many false witnesses came, but they couldn't find 2 that agreed. Jesus was entitled to being acquitted without being questioned as to his defense, and certainly without being compelled to testify against himself. And yet Caiaphas called on Jesus to make a defense which was contrary to law. The high priest stood up and said to him, Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? Instead of protecting and defending the accused required by Jewish law, the high priest himself became an accuser in utter violation of rules and procedure. But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest ahead said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then the high priest tore his robe and said, He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard his blasphemy. It is appalling that when no truthful witness could be brought against Jesus, the high priest, in dramatic rejection, tore his robes and accused Jesus of blasphemy. His answer to his next question had been answered before this late night interrogation had ever begun. "What do you think?" They answered, "He deserves death." And then they spat on his face and they beat him with their fists, and others slapped him. Early in the morning, the scene shifts from the Sanhedrin to the residence of Pilate, the Roman governor. In verse 28 we read, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out and said to them, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?' And they answered and said to him, 'If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you.'" I don't know if they got Pilate out of bed or interrupted his morning cup of coffee, but what they wanted to do couldn't wait. The praetorium where they led Jesus was the official headquarters, judgment seat, and command center of the military leader in the area. Isn't it amazing that these same leaders who won't enter a Gentile's residence because they don't want to risk being ceremonially unclean and not being able to keep the Passover are the same ones who don't mind getting their hands dirty with murder? When Pilate asks what the charge was, they initially won't even answer, but they use the excuse, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." You get the sense that Pilate's not anxious to get involved in a Jewish court case, especially at Passover, so he tried to evade the issue. After all, if the prisoner was creating problems for the Jews, let the Jews try him under their own law. So trying to avoid dealing with the situation altogether, Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." And the Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." I don't know if that's a true statement or not. According to the Jewish law, the penalty for blasphemy was stoning. And commentators aren't clear as to whether or not the Jews had lost the right of execution under Roman rule. But it's clear that in the book of Acts that Stephen, who was also accused of a blasphemy, was stoned to death. Considering not only the lack of evidence, but the innocence of Jesus, making the charge of blasphemy stick would have proven difficult and would not have impressed Pilate to be a crime deserving execution under Roman civil law. The Sanhedrin wanted Jesus dead, but they wanted the Romans to do it. Jesus was betrayed by his disciples and blamed by the religious government, and he was brutalized. Betrayed by the disciples, blamed by the religious leaders, and he was brutalized by the Roman government. It's hard to believe that it's been 14 years ago that the movie The Passion of Christ was realized. After having seen it, the word that came to my mind was it was brutal. I realized that the movie, directed and co-written by Mel Gibson, was an interpretation of the biblical account, and it may have been an accurate one. But if the mistreatment of Jesus by the Roman government depicted in the movie had been softened by half, it still would have been brutal. Having appeared before Caiaphas and Annas and the Sanhedrin, Jesus is now interrogated by Pilate. John doesn't give the full detail of the interrogation, but he wants to move us quickly on to the next stage. After his initial examination of Jesus, the Roman governor says to the Jews in verse 38, "I find no guilt in him." The Jews kept insisting that Jesus was a troublemaker. And Luke records that when Pilate realized that Jesus came from Galilee, he sent him to Herod, where Luke writes, "And Herod questioned him at length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him up in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate." After Jesus was brought back to Pilate, Luke writes, "Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and he said to them, 'You brought me this man as one who incites rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you made against him. nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him." This is the second time that Pilate confesses that Jesus is innocent and has done nothing worthy of death. So in an attempt to free Jesus, Pilate utilizes his authority to grant a pardon of a prisoner as a sign of goodwill during the Passover season. The two candidates presented are Jesus and Barabbas, of whom John says was a robber, which, by the way, is the same word used to describe the two men between whom Jesus was crucified. Matthew says that Barabbas was a notorious prisoner, which is why Pilate offered a choice between these two. Barabbas was a well-known, most wanted criminal, and Jesus was a harmless rabbi. Certainly, given the choice, the crowd would choose Jesus. But they didn't. Influenced by the religious leaders, the crowd chose Barabbas, and Pilate's plan backfired. In a last attempt, Pilate decides to have Jesus punished. So John begins the 19th chapter with, "Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and give him slaps in the face." John doesn't explain what happened when Jesus was scourged. But typically the Romans used a whip called a flagrum, which consisted of small pieces of bone and metal attached to a number of leather strands. The skin of the back was ripped to the bone from scourging. One explanation put it this way: what was abstract horror was the fact that scourging almost always preceded crucifixion, where the centurion would order his lictors to scourge the prisoner to the point of near death, using the brutal flagrum, which was designed to speedily remove flesh, even with a single lash across the back. For the third time, Pilate says to the Jews, "I find no guilt in him." Perhaps Pilate hoped that in presenting a beaten and bloodied and bruised Jesus, along with his insistence that Jesus was innocent, the Jews would have a change of heart, they would feel compassion, and they would have mercy. But they didn't. Instead, they wanted Jesus crucified. Let's pick up some of the narrative beginning in John 19, verse 12. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar, for everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." What a sad, sad statement. So then he handed him over to them to be crucified. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the Skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. And there they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." In his work, The Trial of Jesus, the Honorable Harry Fogel wrote, Jesus was judged before his trial. He was charged with 3 separate crimes. The priests of the Sanhedrin illegally convicted him of blasphemy, but Pilate refused to recognize this initial proceeding. Pilate twice acquitted Jesus of the charge of treason. He was charged with sedition both before Pilate and Herod and was acquitted by each. Yet Jesus was executed under the pretense that he had been found guilty of treason. Threatened with the possible loss of his position, Pilate chose to crucify Jesus as the easiest way to silence angry priests. Before noon that same day, Jesus was crucified in violation of the laws of Israel and Rome, closing the dark chapter in the history of judicial administration and sounding the greatest call the world will ever hear for humans to work together for human justice. Two of the most enlightened systems of the law that ever existed were prostituted to destroy the most innocent man who ever lived. John doesn't record everything that Jesus said on the cross or every single thing that occurred, but he wants us to know that Jesus clearly did die. In verse 30, John writes, "Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, 'It is finished,' and he bowed his head and gave up the spirit." When the soldiers came to hasten the death of those being crucified by breaking their legs, John writes, "But coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, so that you may believe." See, this is John's purpose in writing his gospel, so that you will believe. John ends the chapter with the burial of Jesus by two men, Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple, and Nicodemus, a Pharisee that we met in the 3rd chapter. In verse 40, John says, "So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Betrayed by his disciples, blamed by the religious leaders, and brutalized by the government, Jesus was crucified for the sins of the world. His hour had come, and he fulfilled it to the end." In thinking about these two chapters, I was reminded of these words by Michael W. Smith. "Crucified, laid behind the stone, you lived to die, rejected and alone. Like a rose trampled on the ground, you took the fall and thought of me above all."